in our house, this is one of Ross's absolute favorite Bible verses, and maybe not one of mine. I'm the type who doesn't really like to be told what to worry about and what not to worry about. Thank you very much. And I have always struggled with what is meant to be reassuring in that last verse. Don't worry about tomorrow's troubles, because today's troubles are enough for today. That's supposed to make me feel better? Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. I also struggle with this idea of not worrying about what to eat and what to wear. Half of my life revolves around those two things, what to eat and what to wear. And it's not that I worry that much about it, but after I had kids, I found that actually energy went into deciding who was going to eat what when. The food restriction too. And it became all-consuming. And to be honest, we just had this discussion while we were traveling last weekend. We were in Chicago. And eating out is a major source of anxiety for me, because making sure that everyone in our group can find food that they can safely and will eat, because those two things are not necessarily the same, is a big struggle and a big source of concern for me. But Jesus' words are about more than that. They're about not letting our need to control and provide control. An amazing thing happened. I just barely knew him as an acquaintance through Conference Council on Youth Ministries when I was growing up. And we ended up at Southwestern College together, and then we ended up at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary together. And his name is Adam Barlow Thompson, and he and his wife Ashley, that he met at Garrett, during their time in seminary, began dreaming of a very different kind of ministry. He knew for a long time that even though he would be ordained an elder, as I am, standing in the front of sanctuaries and preaching week in and week out and overseeing the administrative life of the church was not where his call was. They dreamed of a ministry that would allow them to facilitate strong communities in places that hadn't been strong communities in the past. And so he and his wife Ashley and their son Prescott live in the South Central neighborhood in Wichita that for decades has been defined primarily by what it lacked or what was wrong with it. The neighborhood runs along kind of South Broadway, and lots of times people hear about it on the news when something bad has happened there, when there's been a drug bust or a violent crime, and seeped into the identity of the neighborhood. And so Adam and Ashley and some other friends in ministry that shared their vision and their dream moved into this neighborhood and began intentional communal living in the area. And they began to work out a system for teaching people to be good neighbors. Sometimes that sounds redundant or silly to us, like who needs to be taught how to be a good neighbor? You know who needs to be taught how to be a good neighbor? Me. When I went through their process for the first time, we had been living in Marion for 2 years. Swallow to knock on your neighbor's door and say, "Hi, I've been living next to you for 2 years and I don't know you." Yeah, you remember that. It was embarrassing, wasn't it? It was a little awkward. There were a couple of them that we had to do that way. And so I had to learn some neighboring skills. And there's lots and lots of skills. I still get them by text on a weekly basis. I do 52 weeks of neighboring through their organization, the Neighboring Movement. But they have boiled down good neighboring to 3 key ingredients: abundance, relationship, and joy. And the first time I sat down and saw those written on paper, I went, huh, If I were going to write down 3 key ingredients of discipleship, they would look like abundance, relationship, and joy. And I began to realize how close the walk of neighboring and the walk of discipleship are. In fact, so close that neighboring provides a perfect opportunity to practice discipleship. And we began the process with my church in Marion under that sort of idea, that we were learning neighboring as a way of practicing discipleship. The first key ingredient is abundance. And this scripture that we read today, the neighboring movement chose it to go with the key ingredient, the exploration of the key ingredient of abundance. Now, there's lots and lots of scriptures in the Bible that could go with the idea of abundance. But they chose one that invites us to consider how God provides in abundance for parts of creation that we sometimes forget to even think about. How often we walk by the birds gathered around eating seed or drinking from a puddle and pay no attention to how it is that they find their food and their drink and their shelter. But God provides what they need in abundance. Not only that, but Jesus invites us to consider the lilies, the flowers of the field in all of their beauty. And to remember that they didn't sit poring over a catalog or Pinterest or a fashion show, deciding what to put on next for their particular body shape, age, and type. But instead, God provided them with finery unlike anything we could imagine. That's the kind of abundance Jesus is inviting the disciples to live in. The kind of abundance that doesn't leave us space for worry. Y'all will get tired of hearing this quote, but I continue to be amazed at how often I come back to Walter Brueggemann's idea that the story of the Bible is the story of God's people learning to live abundance in a world that shouts scarcity. And it's not just economic, although it is economic. But it's not just economic, right? The world shouts scarcity at us about everything, about our time. How often do I find myself telling Ross or Diana or the kids or somebody else that I'm talking to that there's just not enough time? There's just not enough time. I ran out of time. I didn't have enough time. There's not enough time for all the things that I want to be doing. There's just not enough time. I feel that scarcity intensely every day. I feel it in the morning trying to get my kids out to school. I feel it during my office hours that go by much faster than I ever imagined possible because there's so much more I want to get done. I feel it in the evenings when we're trying to get people to and from activities and also get homework done, and we're supposed to be reading with them for 20 minutes every night, and when's the last time you all cleaned your room? And there's not enough time. And I feel that scarcity, and it starts to just crush at me. And then God goes and invites a different way of seeing things. I don't have any less time than anybody else. I get the same 24 hours in every day as everybody else. My problem is an abundance of choices about what to do with my time. That's a privilege. I am not scrambling for survival. I am not out in the woods hunting for nuts and berries to bring back enough to nourish my children. I have an abundance of choices about what I choose to do with each one of those minutes and hours and days. Well, suddenly that doesn't feel like a crushing problem so much as it does a real joy. And what a great problem that I have so many good things to choose from that I have difficulty choosing. But that's not a scarcity problem. That's an abundance and a joy. I also get worried about scarcity of skills in myself. I have friends who are incredible at so many things. And particularly when I forget to take big picture into consideration, I begin to compare myself to this skill in this person and this skill in this, the perfect pastor. I look at the graphic design stuff that this one's always putting out on social media, and I read about the class that this person is teaching in their church, and the sermon series that this one is doing, and the way that this one has led their church through a such and such administrative process, and the way this one does budgeting, and suddenly I feel in myself this vacuum of leadership skills. Except Jesus invites a different way of looking at it. Because you know what I really have? I have an abundance of resources. I have a friend who's really good at graphic design, and another one whose imagination for sermon series is a powerful creative spark, and another one for whom budgeting and administrative work isn't difficult and can talk me through it in an hour over the phone. I don't have a scarcity problem. I have the joy of abundance at a network of really incredible people who care about the ministry of the church as a whole, not just their local congregation, and whom we can tap. I begin to sometimes think through all the resources we don't have. When you go visit some other church and you see what they're doing and what they've got and the way they've remodeled such and such room, and you start to think, man, if only we had a space that would turn into a coffee bar like that. Wow, what would that be like? If only we had that lighting system that can change the mood that way. If only we had somebody who liked doing the altar displays, or a potter who would come in and be working on a wheel while I preached from Jeremiah. But the thing is, those pastors didn't know they had those things until they asked. There are resources, there is abundance in this congregation that we haven't tapped yet. There are people with gifts and talents sitting in these pews, sitting in the pews earlier this morning, sitting at home, who are dying to be asked to use their God-given gifts for the good of the church. There is abundance all around us. And it's amazing to me how often just shifting that lens, the ability to look for what we have and lean into the abundance that we find, changes everything. Begins to seep into our way of thinking about God. When we begin to think about God as an abundant God, the kind of God who cares about the little birds and the flowers of the field, and how much more that God cares for me. How much more that God will provide abundantly for us. Then we begin to realize that other things aren't a scarce resource either. God's love is not a scarce resource, but is abundant in ways that are difficult for us to even imagine. God's grace and mercy are not a finite resource, a pot that will eventually reach the bottom, but instead are abundant always finding more. I sort of think a little bit about my own childhood, because I had a mom who could always expand the table. I mean, that was just how she was. It's how life worked at our house. There was always room for more at our table. And even when my dad was in seminary and our financial resources were scarce, my mom never said no when we asked if friends could eat dinner with us. My mom never waited to have dinner until after the last of the daycare kids went home because there wasn't enough to go around. My mom never said no to a traveler coming through who needed a sandwich or something to get them by on the road. She had this way of making whatever we were having stretch. It was a skill I had to figure out how to tap into myself in seminary. When my husband, who never met a stranger and who loves to be in the midst of people, he's an introvert, but he loves big gatherings. It's sort of a weird mix, but he loves to be around the people that he cares about. And so we would be studying and we would sort of hit a wall. And I mean, you'd hit that wall hard and you realize you were hungry and you were sick of the four buildings of the seminary and you were tired of the cold and you were tired of the view and you just wanted to go somewhere else. That somewhere else was very often our apartment because we lived off campus. And so before I knew what was happening, Ross would invite everybody to come over to our apartment for dinner. And I'd sit there and I'd think, okay, well, we had enough for us to have spaghetti tonight. So if I add another package of noodles to the same amount of sauce and meat, and if somebody brings a salad and somebody else brings a loaf of bread, we'll probably make it. And always we did. Always there was enough. And not only that, those meals were often more satisfying than they would have been if we'd sat and eaten them by ourselves. Because to the mix of the food on the table, we added laughter and friendship and relationship and silliness and all of the things that we needed to restore our souls and to get back to the work of studying. And I really, truly believe that God's abundance is like that. That when we begin to look at the world through eyes that see abundance, when we begin to believe that God's abundance really is big enough for all of us, that God really does care about each and every one of us, we begin to participate in the abundance and we begin to be restored and refilled and satisfied by it in a way that scarcity can never, ever do for us. And we become a different kind of disciple, one who shows the way of a God of abundance by living a life that trusts in abundance and who rejoices in the abundance we see all around us. Thanks be to God. Amen.